Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Vorhies, your host. I'm the Editorial Director with Data Science Central, and I'm also the Chief Data Scientist for Data Magnum. I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Pivotal, Microsoft, Hortonworks, Oracle, IBM, and Teradata, to name just a few. Now, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com. If you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. So today's webinar is entitled From Visual Analysis to Presentation. Now, before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format for today's webinar. Today's event will be 1 hour long. We have one presenter that I'll introduce in just a minute. There will be a 10 or 15-minute Q&A following the presentation. And this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com in the next few days following today's live event. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Robert Kosara of Tableau. Robert's a research scientist at Tableau Software and formerly Associate Professor of Computer Science at UNC Charlotte. He's created visualization techniques like parallel sets and performed research into perceptual and cognitive basics of visualization. Recently, Robert's research has focused on how to communicate data using tools from visualization and how storytelling can be adapted to incorporate data, interaction, and visualization. He received his Master of Science and PhD degrees in Computer Science from Vienna University of Technology in Vienna, Austria. Thanks for being with us today, Robert. We're looking forward to your presentation. So while most of us understand how to analyze our data using visualization quite well and are well aware of the overall importance of using visualization to present our findings, the process of going from one to the other is still often a challenge and otherwise poorly understood. In today's Data Science Central webinar, data visualization research scientist Robert Kosara will walk through an example of an analysis project to illustrate the process of analyzing data, finding the key insights, and then turning them into an effective presentation. So Robert, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning. So as Bill said, my name is Robert Kosara. I'm a research scientist here at Tableau Research, and I am interested in how we present data, how we talk to people about data, and how we talk to people about whatever we want to get across using data and using visualization to present those things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what analysis is and how it's different from presentation, or actually rather what presentation is and how it's different from analysis, and then show you a few examples both for the news media and walk you through a very simple analysis example to show you how you can use your own findings and can turn them into a little story. So analysis is something that many of you, I'm sure, have done, and I'm going to just show you a very silly little example here. This is an example of data that we ship with Tableau. It's called Superstore, and we're looking at overall sales here over time, which is one view of the data, and then you might look at data a different way because you might look at different categories of what kinds of things you're showing or you're selling, like furniture and office supplies and so on. And then you're looking at the customer segments. So you've got consumers and corporate customers and home office customers, and then maybe one more, which is how you ship those things and how much of that is through first-class shipping or other kinds of shipping and so on. And none of this is in itself is particularly interesting. In fact, many of those things are things you just do as you're analyzing your data. You're just looking at your data, you're exploring what's in your data, and you want to be able to do that without having to remember what you're doing, because that's what the machine is for. It has your data and it's supposed to show you your data and let you work with it. But what you're creating here are simply analysis views, and those tend to be very different from what you actually want to use when you present data. So when you talk about analysis, what you want to do is you want to explore a lot. You want to go through a lot of different things, and you want to ask lots of different questions. That's really what exploration is. And what analysis is in many cases, you look at some data, you have a new question based on what you just saw, you try that, you see if that leads you somewhere else. And as you're doing this, you explore a lot of your data. You end up with sometimes hundreds of different views of many, many different parts of your data. You might be filtering, you might be looking at different types of data, different parts of your data, different subsets, and a large amount of data, perhaps. But and I'll get into what that means for presentation in a second, because for presentation you want to reduce that. You don't want to show everything. And it's okay to have dead ends. In fact, it's actually a good sign. If you end up in lots of dead ends, that means that you're actually exploring, that you're really getting into the data and you're really trying out new things. If you already know what's in your data and what you're going to find, it's not going to be interesting. You're just going to find what you already know. So having lots of dead ends is actually a good thing. It means that you're exploring new ground. So, but now you've done this, how does presentation look in comparison? What does presentation actually mean, and what do you want in a presentation? And that is very different. So in presentation, what you want to do, first of all, you want to make it interesting. You want to keep people engaged. You want people to pay attention to what you're telling them. And you're not going to do that by showing them everything that you've done, because you just spent weeks with your data, walking people through everything. It's just not going to work. It's going to be incredibly boring, and it won't lead them anywhere. They will just lose the thread. They won't be able to follow what you're doing. The second part is you want them to understand. And to understand, to help people understand is very different from just showing them what you've done. You have to walk them through an argument. You have to walk them through a way of thinking, and rather than just showing them the data. And I will talk about this in a little bit when I talk about the types of transitions that you can use when you walk through your data. And then the final part is memory. You want to have people actually remember what you told them, because otherwise, what would be the point of even doing that if people don't even remember what they just saw and what you were trying to tell them? And this is very different from analysis. So what I was trying to say earlier about these charts of you not having to remember what they were showing you, this was not so much about you not remembering your insights, because those are of course important, but the little pieces of them and all the data that's in there, that's really not important for you, because you can always go back to them. Your analysis is always there, and you can go back to it if you need to and when you need to. But so you don't have to remember every detail of what you did, because you just refer back to that. But when you talk to people, what you want to get across is a takeaway. You want them to remember a part of what you told them. And that's really the key difference between analysis and presentation. And that also means that the way you show the data is going to be different. And I'll show you a few examples in a moment what that can mean. So in presentation, the other thing is that your operations, the things that you do, are different. In an analysis, you're going to filter your data, you're going to switch through different kinds of views and so on. You're going to go from one type of chart to another type of chart. You're going to look at subsets of the data, different regions, different types of things. In a presentation, you want to actually reduce the amount of switching around and rather do things like pointing things out, emphasizing things, walking people through an argument, explaining to people. And those are different because you're preparing them for the audience, for the viewer, and what their needs are, what they need to know, and what they need to see. And what you don't want to do, and again, I'm going to keep saying this a few times because it's really important, is you don't want to retrace your steps. If you just show people, what did I do last summer, that's not going to be a very interesting presentation. And you also don't want to show them every bit of data. And so one thing that I see sometimes that people have these very elaborate dashboards that they've created to analyze the data that have lots of filters on them, lots of views, and they're great for analysis. They're also great as dashboards to see what's going on. But as presentation tools, they're really poor because they're showing too much. So you really, I'm going to talk about this a bit later, but you want to really reduce what you're showing. You really want to get just to the basic parts, just the important parts of what you're showing, and only show those and nothing else. And so my final bit here of direct presentation advice, perhaps, is, first of all, so how do you improve presentations? The way I always encourage people to do this is to look for good ones. It's the same thing with writing. It's the same thing with presentation style. If you look at what people do well, when you watch what the good ones, then you can actually learn a lot from that. So the first one here is news graphics, because I think that news graphics are really doing a really good job at presentation of data, and I will show you a few examples in a moment. And so learning from those and kind of stealing ideas from them, I think, is a very good way of getting better at presenting your data. And it also changes your way of thinking about how you're doing your presentation. You go away from the analysis and you think more about the audience. The second one is graphical jokes, and I'm going to show you one of those, but the main thing is that those can be helpful to just show you how little you need to represent an idea, and that can be, not that you should necessarily be joking about your data, but there are ideas in there that can be pretty useful. And then finally, comics. I will talk about comics a little bit a little later on when I talk about structure a bit, but there's quite a bit of work in comic theory that is quite useful in understanding how transitions work and how higher level structure works. And I think we can learn quite a bit from that. And then the second big point here is to think about the audience. So when you're presenting for an audience, and you have to think about who that audience is, what they know, and what they probably want to know. So give them the information they need, and don't give them the information they don't need. But the key issue here very often is what's called the curse of knowledge. You know something that your audience probably doesn't know, and it's hard often for people to make sure that, or to understand what they have to tell the audience and what they need to get across for the audience to really understand what they're talking about. And that can be both. It can actually go both ways. It can be too much and it can be too little. And then, but usually it's too little. So the curse of knowledge is really about you knowing something, and it's hard for you to relate to somebody not knowing what you know. And then the second point here is to go from the known to the unknown. So a good presentation, just like any good piece of writing, any good way of relaying something, goes from the known to the unknown. So you start by telling people the things they're already familiar with, and then lead them from there into the new things. And then the final point, again, as I'm saying, I'm going to keep pounding on this. So reduce, because you want to really just get the points that you want to show. So with that, I'm going to show you a few examples from the news media. You should be seeing my browser here in a second. I have 4 examples that I will walk through very quickly, but I just want to show you a few examples of how information is being shown. This first one is from a New York Times story from 2009. It's about the Copenhagen climate talks. And this is a common format here. There is what's called a stepper that steps you through these separate steps in this presentation. And it's a little bit of an argument that they make, which is quite interesting. So the first frame here is a map. And I can click here. We now see that they're talking about emissions for different countries, different countries in Europe. So China, the US, Europe, and India. And you can see the emissions, total emissions here over time. This is until about 2006 or 7. And you can see how it is increasing for China, how the US is increasing, Europe being fairly flat, and India increasing slowly. And so the argument apparently was that they were talking about how to measure emissions. So rather than looking at total emissions, perhaps looking at emissions per capita would be a way of doing that. And you can see that it looks quite different. The US, of course, has the highest emissions per capita by quite a bit, and then there's Europe and China and India. Or perhaps a different way of looking at this would be to look at emissions per dollar of GDP. And that looks very good for China because China's GDP has been increasing very quickly, and so it looks like their emissions are decreasing, when in fact, of course, their total emissions are still increasing. And so apparently the proposal that China made was to say, well, let's look at GDP as emissions per dollar of GDP, which means it's going to look good for us, and we can do this. But in reality, or measured differently, I should say, in total emissions, this is what that means. It means that total emissions would be increasing. But the US proposal apparently was to say, well, no, we're going to go with the total emissions. And I like this story because it lays out very nicely this kind of argument, this back and forth. And you can also imagine doing this with any kind of data. There is always this question of how do you measure this? How do you think about this particular question we have? And that can be quite different depending on what kind of measure you use. So this back and forth of different measures and different ways of looking at the data can be quite useful. But this stepping through here is really what makes this work. Here's a different story, and I just lost my place in the on this page. If I can find it again. Yeah, no, this is not what I was looking for. Where did it go? Okay, let's just skip this one now. Sorry about that. I had a story open here that I actually like quite a bit. Maybe I clicked on something by mistake. Strange. Anyway, so I'm going to skip that one. There's a very good story there about the number of male and female professors at Harvard Business School and how that number was supposed to change over time, but it's not actually doing that, because you can see that the number of incoming assistant professors isn't higher for the women than for the men who are already there. It's a good story, but I'm not going to bother looking for it right now. My third example here is a story from Bloomberg Business that is called The Rise of Long-Term Joblessness. And this is an example that's very simple, which is actually why I want to show it, because it just uses highlighting here to walk you through something. What this does is it uses a visualization that's called the connected scatter plot. And this is something I'm interested in because I've actually done some work on this, and I have a paper coming out about it fairly soon. And it's really interesting because the technique has only really been used in news graphics and not very much outside of that. And what they're doing here is they're using the original one, which is this is a curve that's called the UV curve, which stands for unemployment vacancy curve. What they're doing here is that they're plotting job openings, or vacancies versus long-term unemployment. And this is also called the Beveridge curve, if anybody is familiar with that. And they're showing how that's changing, because the theory is that the lines should basically be going back and forth along a line here, and kind of not leave this kind of plane that sits in here, and there's some argument about how that relates to what's called the natural unemployment rate. And when you look at this and you click through the story, you can then see this argument about how that's actually changing, because there is a change in the way in the numbers, and they're moving to a different place. So if I'm walking through these three steps here, which are different years or different ranges of years, what's happening is that on this fairly complex curve, it's highlighting different sections, and it's telling me what those are. And there are annotations here that also explain a bit more about what's going on here. And that's a very nice way of looking at this and going, wow, this is kind of complicated. There's lots of stuff going on here in this curve. But because they also added this shading in the back that simplifies the curve for you already, and then they walk you through these three steps, it's easier to follow along. And you get the engagement, hopefully here, from looking at something that looks interesting but not too scary, but that you still can look at these annotations then and learn something about how these numbers have been changing over the last 10, 15 years or so. And then my last example is one that's also from Bloomberg, that is a different section of Bloomberg, that is more recent. The ones I just showed you are all about 2 or 3 years old. In fact, the first one was supposed to be even older than that. But this last one here is from earlier this year, from June this year. And this is a very nice argument too that walks you through the argument around global warming. And this is an example of what's called scrolly telling, because it's using scrolling to tell you a story. Not my favorite term in the world, but it's used for this kind of thing. And what they're doing here is as you scroll, what happens is that they will walk through different explanations. So they're basically saying, here the black or the dark gray here is the observed change in global temperatures. And now the question is, what's doing that? What is causing that? So they're saying, well, is it the Earth's orbit? And they're showing you data that looks at orbital changes, and you can see that doesn't line up that well. So let's try something else. Is it the sun? Well, this is how the sun's temperature changes over decades and centuries. This is data going back to 1880. And you can see, I don't know, that doesn't make much sense. This doesn't change much. Is it volcanoes, perhaps? Because volcanoes might be causing this, and here are volcano eruptions and the amount of greenhouse gases they emit, and you can see that doesn't do a whole lot either. And then they combine those three. So they say, well, let's look at all these natural causes and combine them, and taken together, this is what they look like. So you can see this is clearly not what it's doing, or what's doing this. So now let's see if there are human-based causes or human causes here. So there's deforestation here. Is it deforestation? Nah, maybe. I don't know. This doesn't look like it because actually if deforestation, land use is going down. That doesn't seem to line up that well. Is it ozone pollution? And you can see that there's a bit more going on here. This is getting a bit closer to maybe being a factor if you scale that up, but it doesn't look like that either. And then there's aerosols. Aerosols are going the other way, so they're actually probably not the reason. And now we're looking at greenhouse gases, and lo and behold, they trace really nicely with this. And so looking at that and combining all of those together, you can actually play with that now and see which ones, which of these human factors. So this is the human factors now taken together. They actually trace really well on this chart, and you can see that makes the most sense. And you can actually play with that too. So at the end here, you can mouse over these things at the bottom and start exploring a bit yourself. Now this is actually showing you quite a bit of data, which is, I think, a good way of doing this because you want to convince people, and you want to argue that this is the case, but they're not overwhelming you with too much data, and they're presenting it very slowly. So they're showing you one thing after the other, and I think in the very last step here, you can then actually play with this a bit more and actually look at all the factors and see how they all compare and turn them on and off. So the way people think in journalism is very useful to think about because theirs is a very different perspective. They want to get things across to people, and they're very good at that. They tend to really know a lot about how people understand things and then how to get information across to them. So news media, and in particular, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Bloomberg are really good examples of people to follow, and they tend to be really good at building those things. In particular, the New York Times has some really amazing people there. This example I'm actually showing you on the slide I didn't include here because it's a bit too complicated. I didn't want to spend so much time on it. But this one is also a good one that uses highlighting to look at a different kind of connected scatter plot. This one's looking at inflation and unemployment, and it highlights different sections for different Federal Reserve chairs. And so it talks about how during their tenure, what things happened and how the economy changed during their time by using highlighting again and by using annotations and text there on the left. So news media are one of the examples that I mentioned. The other one is these little graphical jokes. So this thing is called Hangry, and I'm going to give you a second to read this. This is by Jessica Hagee, who runs this little website called This Is Indexed, and she has these little bits of wisdom that she creates using these simple charts. They're often little line charts, little Venn diagrams, or very simple scatter plots, and they're surprisingly effective. And I think you can really learn quite a bit from what she's doing by looking at just kind of the way you can reduce the information and just get the main things across, and also the use of text. So this is all about the text. If you're looking at a simple sketch of a simple idea, then maybe what you should be showing is a sketch and not nearly as much data as most people want to show. I'm not usually a big fan of quotes, but this one I really like. This is from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I think actually it's from the Little Prince. It says, perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Now, we're not necessarily striving for perfection here, but I think this idea of reducing the amount of information shown is really important. And reduction or reducing the information is really something that can be done in different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to remove the data, but it might mean that you have to just de-emphasize a lot of it, and I will talk about that in a moment. So my message really is, and this is kind of my big takeaway, I think most people could just benefit hugely by just doing this one thing, which is reduce, and then reduce again. And again, by reducing, I don't necessarily mean removing, but to highlight the important things and to remove or reduce the things and de-emphasize, that's the word, de-emphasize the things that are not important. And because that way you can control clutter and just get people to see the key thing you want them to see. So let me show you a very simple example of an analysis. I'm going to switch back here to sharing my screen. There we go. So I'm going to walk you through a very, very simple analysis here using Tableau. What you see here is a data set that looks complicated, and it's supposed to look complicated, but what it shows is unemployment data for about, I think, 500 or so metro areas in the US over about 15 years. So this is data this is the most current data, actually. This is not including last month's data, which was just released, I think, on Friday. And if you saw the reports, the unemployment rate is down to like 5% now. But what interests me about unemployment rate is how that actually breaks down for different people and different areas. And what this is showing you here is that this 5% number isn't really all that useful, because there's obviously a huge amount of variation. So what you see here is that there are these lines that are showing these metro areas here for different parts of the US, and you can see that this goes back, I think, to January 2000 here. Yeah, it should be, if I can hit the last point here, it should be January, and then going all the way to I think of September this year. Yes. So you can see that because this big ribbon here has changed over the years quite a bit, and you can see this is the majority of the data, and that would be mostly tracking what you would hear on the news as the unemployment rate. So somewhere in here is the mean value. But there are also outliers, and there are some places in the US that have way higher unemployment rates. There's this place here in California, El Centro, which, by the way, is right on the border with Mexico, that had up to 30% unemployment rate there at some point during the last few years. There's another place here in Yuma, Arizona, which is actually very close to El Centro. I looked at these on a map earlier. That's also very high. It's lower, it's 25%, but it's still very, very high. 1 out of 4 people are unemployed. And then this place here in Puerto Rico. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk about some of that data. So I'm going to not actually do much analysis here. I'm mostly going to focus on just preparing this for presentation. So what I'm going to do here as my first step here is I'm going to duplicate my sheet here first. And you can't actually see that right now because the menu is off your screen here. It's on my screen. But I'm going to just make a copy of this, and then I'm just going to select this part here. I'm going to use this feature here. It's called Create Set. And I'm going to make a set that just collects these areas. The thing is that metro areas aren't cities, but they can go across state lines. So this area plus state field here collects those. And what I can do now is I can take this set, and I should have named this something better. I'm going to rename this and call them outliers. And now I can put the outliers on color here. And what it's going to do is it's going to emphasize the outliers, and it's going to de-emphasize the other data. So that way I can show more clearly what I want to show. In fact, I could even say, well, no, this is not even enough. I want to make this a bit lighter. So maybe just use the, no, maybe let's do the light palette here. Make this very light gray. So now I can see the rest of the data still in this light gray, but the data I want to show and want to point out is a much stronger blue. So I'm going to also call this one here outliers. It's going to make this a bit easier later on. Another thing I might have noticed is that there is this big spike here. And I sometimes show this to people and have them guess what that might be. And if you look at the date, you might have guessed. So this is in the middle of 2006 or 2005, and the September 2005. And once you mouse over here, it's kind of obvious because of the place. So this is Mississippi, and then the next place here is Louisiana. This was Hurricane Katrina that caused a huge spike here in unemployment rate. And it is obviously interesting to point out. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just make a different view. I'm going to also, again, duplicate my sheet here. And I'm going to change the way I'm showing the data to instead show me the difference rather than the actual data. And that way, these spikes, so this is now the difference from the previous value. So each value here doesn't show me the value of that at that point, but how it's different from the same place the month before. And so now these spikes are very easy to select. So I'm going to just select this here. I'm just going to do the same thing here. I'm going to make another set, and I'm going to call this one Katrina, spell that correctly. And I want to just select the areas. I don't care about, I want to just restrict it to these times. I'm going to do this, and again, make a copy here where I'm going to take the Katrina set, put that on color, and now you can see the Katrina spike here, and I'm just going to change this color as well because I just changed the other one. So I'm just going to keep them similar so that these stand out a bit more. And now I have my Katrina sheet here. And then my last one that I'm going to do because it's also another thing that kind of stands out here. There are certain spikes here that are interesting. I'm going to just pick one of them because I happen to know the reason for that one. Maybe just this part here. I'm trying to just get this spike here and not the one next to it. So these here, I'm going to just select these. And what's happening here is, I'm just going to leave it unlabeled for a moment. If I, again, create a new one here, one of the things that's very useful when doing presentation like that is just to make lots of new sheets and play with those and not change your original one. So somewhere here I have my new set that I just created. I think it's this one. And so what you see here is that there was a strange step here in unemployment rates, and of course this was true for everybody, but in particular it was true for a few places in Indiana and the place I'm looking for is Ohio, which was these places. I think there are 3 or 4 here that were caused by the oil industry and the collapse of some of the manufacturers that were making parts for the oil industry. So this, I'm just going to call it auto industry. So now what I've done here is I have 3 sheets here that let me walk through a little argument that we'll get to in a little bit when I talk about building the actual story. But as you can see here, if I walk through this, so we've got the outliers here. We've got Katrina. I'm just going to fix the color here because I barely didn't do this right. change the color so that's the same. So we've got Outliers, we've got Katrina, and we've got the all industry, which also needs to be changed here. So in thinking about how I want to show this is what I'm already doing. So this is not pure analysis, of course. Here, what I'm doing is I'm basically doing this to show something. But I can now use these kinds of views to point things out. And it doesn't matter that there is a lot of data here, because your eyes are clearly drawn to the things that I want to show you. But the other data is still there. So if I give you this workbook, you can then go explore and say, well, yeah, but I see a spike here. What is that? Or I want to know what's down here. Like, who are the people, or which are the areas that are really low in unemployment rate? And you can find those. This is, interestingly, this is all North and South Dakota. And, okay, not all of it. And you can explore further. So I'm not taking away the data, but I'm trying to make the interesting parts stand out more, and the parts that are supporting data just be there to support and not be the main part. So I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I want to talk a little bit before that, though, about how you transition between different views. And one of the ideas that I really like that I think are very effective for this is to look at comics. So this is an image that I think that this was drawn by Scott McCloud, but it's using an idea from Michael Eisner, who is and I'm probably getting the name wrong, I think, or his name was perhaps Will Eisner. Either way, one of the greats of comics a while ago, in the 60s or so, and he talked about comics being sequential art. And I like this thinking about sequence. We have to think a lot more when we present data about how we sequence the information. And what I'm going to show you now is a few examples of steps of sequences or ways of sequencing, organizing your steps that are based on what Scott McCloud has done. I'm going to talk about his book at the end of this section. And to show you a few examples of what those look like in data visualization. And these are examples that I took from Tableau Public. This is an example of a moment-to-moment transition, which goes through time. So what's happening here is that this first frame that I'm showing you is a map of London, and the little bubbles are the bike rental stations. They're called the Vorhies bikes in London. And each bubble here, each blue bubble, is a number of available bikes, and each red bubble is the number of bikes that are in the station but not available. So they're damaged or they can't be taken out for whatever reason. And you can see that there's a good distribution of them. There are lots of bike stations here. And this is all showing you essentially the central part and kind of the big part of London here. And what happened, and so this is a typical like Thursday, I think. And what happened in the summer, in July, I believe, was that there was a strike on the tube, the London Underground, and so people had trouble getting home because they shut down the Underground at like 5 in the afternoon. And so what somebody was showing here, Jonathan McDonald was looking at is how did that impact, or how much did people use these bikes, these Vorhies bikes? And it turns out they did. So this is now the view of, I think, that particular day later that night. And you can see that all the bikes have moved to the outskirts, or to as far out as they possibly can, and still be in the stations to return them. Because, of course, nobody lives in the city of London, right, in downtown London, but everybody had to get home, so they all had to get out of the city. And you can see there were no bikes left at that point in the city because they have all been taken by people trying to figure out a way to get home. So we're looking at 2 time steps here. That's really what I'm trying to get across here, is that you go from time step 1 to time step 2, and then you could keep going like that, but you walk through time that way and tell people a story across time or over time. A different kind of transition is what's called subject to subject. In this case, we're looking at flight delays. These are different airports in the US, and you can see the overall flight delays. I don't know what the time frames here. But you can see that Dallas-Fort Worth is the worst here in this particular example. But you walk through different subjects. So we're looking at one first, looking at Chicago, then at Denver, and so on. And then we look through and we walk through those airports. And as you do that, you walk through the same kind of thing. And I will show you in a moment what it looks like when it's different. So moment to moment should be very obvious. Subject to subject is where you walk through different parts of your data, different aspects, not aspects because that's what we're going to get to right now, but different elements in the data. And then there are different aspects of the data. So here's an example of crime data in Chicago, and this is very nicely done with using the story points feature in Tableau, where they are looking at different types of things you might want to know about in terms of crime data. So for example, you might want to look at where does crime happen, at what days, what time of day, what are hotspots, what are trends, and what does it mean for real estate. So you can think about these as different questions that you're going to ask, and there's a lot of data here that you can look at, but you want to present that in a sequence that makes sense and that kind of walks people through the kind of the next question that comes up after having seen what they just saw. So moment to moment, subject to subject, and aspect to aspect are really the most critical ones. There are a few more. In particular, there's one that's very common in data visualization, which is the non sequitur. And of course, that is one that's uncommon in comics, but it's surprisingly common when you talk about data. So here's an example that I'm picking on a Tableau person here. This Jules Lurie, who's one of our data analysts in the Tableau public team. She built this very nice little view of, it's also too much data, by the way. So this is showing you baby names over time, how common they are, how popular they are. And they looked at a few different things, but there's no connection. So one is the number of the names of pop divas. Then they looked at Mary, different variations of the name Mary. Then they picked their own names, the different people on the Tableau public team and how common those are. And then I think the last step here is to be able to explore itself. But there's just no connection between them. It's all different things, and they're not really cohesive in any kind of way. And I'm not picking on her here. It's just that this is very common, that I found these 15 different things. Here they are. That's how a lot of presentations work. And so I think you should really think about how you present your data and how you sequence it. So what I just talked about is a very, very small part of this book that's called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is a really, really interesting book. It's very readable. It's actually a comic itself, and it has a lot of really great ideas in it and lots of interesting, a lot of interesting thinking about comics and visual thinking. And I think a lot of it is actually quite applicable to how data stories could work as well. I'm also leaving out two types of transitions here because they wouldn't fit. I just wanted to mention them here for completeness. But this is a highly recommended book to read if you're interested in learning a bit more about storytelling and about how people think about story. And with that, I'm going to just do a little bit more on the story side here, because I'm running over a little bit. I'm going to have to close very soon, but let me just switch over. I've done most of the work here that I wanted to do, but the main thing would be just to kind of turn this into a story. So I built my views here, and I built them as separate views. You could do more of this, especially in Tableau, by using stories. But I'm going to just do this here. I'm going to make a story and make this a bit smaller. And what I can do here is, in this story, I can give it a title. So I could look at, this is now showing up on the wrong screen here for me, but the title I could change here and say the story of unemployment. This is not very clever, but I think it's really interesting to think about how unemployment isn't just one number. So we could start with the first step. Probably should be something else. It shouldn't be. Maybe let's just show the big picture here. So this is kind of the initial view is everything. And then I'm going to take the outliers and put them in there next. And then, Katrina, I'm going to, usually what you would want to do here is to make a a dashboard, so you have a bit more control over the layout. I'm not going to do this, so this is just going to be my overview. And then here are the outliers. And then here's Katrina. And what you actually would want to do here is you would want to add a lot more explanation, but I'm going to just, because I'm running late, I'm going to just go with this. And now I have built a little story that starts with an overview and then walks you through different subjects in this case, because I'm filtering down. So I'm going to explain that this is a subject-to-subject transition. We're going from the overview, which I would have to resize, and then to the outliers, and then to Katrina, and then to the auto industry. And then we could end up with something smart about how that has been changing or what we've learned from that, which I haven't gone into much detail about here because I'm also not an expert on this kind of data. But you can see how you can structure, you can look at a lot of data, make that more understandable as a presentation, as something you want to tell people about, and then turn it into a little story that actually presents the data rather than just throwing all the data at them. Because that's the common thing that people do. They just kind of throw all the data at you. And so giving it a framing by having a title, having something to say about that, and showing that over using some simple means like highlighting, like also labels and so on, that would then show you what are those things and what are the causes, what's the reason you want to show this, is a very effective way of then actually presenting rather than just throwing the data at people. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. And back to Bill.
Hey, Robert, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We'll get started with today's Q&A session, and I want to thank the audience for their participation. We've had a lot of questions that have come in during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. So during this Q&A portion, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for Robert if you'd like to get a hold of him following today's webinar. So let's get started. Robert, certainly you illustrated well how difficult it is to pull the story out of the data. And one of our questions seems so on target. It's, is there an app for that? That is there a tool that will create the story for me?
Right, so I didn't actually talk very much about the story structure, but I think that there are certainly ideas that people have that you could think would be, they're clear enough so that you can actually turn them into some sort of tool, but I don't think that that's something that exists, because you need to be able to tell the story. You are the storyteller. You have a point of view, and you have a message that you want to get across. So turning that into an app would be very difficult, I think. There certainly could be more support for structuring a story based on what you found, what views you have. But as far as I know, that doesn't actually exist. But I think that's really interesting as a thought, that you want to think about why do I tell a story? Well, it's because I have a point of view, and that needs to be expressed. And doing that is really the art. And perhaps there will be ways of making that easier at some point, but I think it's really still important to have the human in control here and have them create that.
Okay, so our audience would also like to know, then, is there a particular book that you would recommend to help with learning how to structure or frame the storytelling?
Yeah, so I think that understanding comics is quite interesting there on kind of a very low level, because it talks about these transitions. It's also talking about more structural, bigger things. But there is some more work. There's a book by Neil Cohn, that's C-O-H-N, who talks about what he calls the narrative grammar of comics. So this is another comic one, but he talks about the higher. It's not actually a comic. This is a book with text, but he talks about the kind of the higher level structure of how comics work, and he has some interesting ideas about common structures that are interesting and helpful to kind of use and turn and use as kind of blueprints for your stories, for your data stories in our case.
Okay, and Robert, one more time. I'm sorry. What was the title of that book?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I should have written this down somewhere, but it's the narrative grammar. I'm actually blanking right now on the actual correct title. It's something like the grammar of the visual language of comics. That's what it's called. Sorry, the visual language of comics by Neil Cohn. Cohn is his last name. And so the visual language of comics is about how structure works in comics. And then there is a book by Michael Austin that talks about structure, about story as well. It's called, for some reason I'm blanking on all these book titles right now, but maybe we can put this on a list somewhere after the
okay.
afterwards.
Yeah, that'll be terrific.
But there are certainly more books that talk about narrative. Actually, one thing I should mention, this is actually a good one, and I actually remember the title right now, is by Dan Heath and his brother. It's called Made to Stick. This is actually easy to find. Made to Stick is a really good book about marketing and about stories in marketing, but a lot of that is applicable across a lot of different areas. And they have lots of really good ideas about how you structure information, how you get people to pay attention to your information, and it's a really interesting book. I think they're called Dan and Chip Heath. I think the book is certainly called Made to Stick, and it's got a big piece of sticky tape on the front. It's very easy to find.
Terrific. Hey, thanks for that answer. You know, the Bloomberg visualization that you showed us on global warming has really caught the audience's attention. Is there a special software necessary to produce that sort of dynamic display?
Well, a lot of the examples, but actually one of them, the examples I showed you was still done in Flash. This was back in 2009 or so. And a lot of these are, in fact, all of the ones I showed you are custom code. So this is work that they do manually to build these stories. And that's because the people at Bloomberg and also the New York Times, they have the manpower to do that. They have the people there that can do that. Doing very elaborate stories can obviously be very difficult. So that really requires a lot of custom coding. In Tableau, you can use story points to create pretty good stories that people can then walk through and also interact with. But if you need perfect control, there's still the custom coding is still the thing that people do, especially in journalism.
Right. Well, unfortunately, that would be more difficult. But tell me, Tableau has a story dashboard built in that the audience thinks is really a great tool. Can that story dashboard be published to a server?
Yes. So anything you do on a story in Tableau, if you publish it to a server, whether it's Tableau Public or Tableau Online or your own server, it's going to look exactly like that in the server. So and then you can also interact with it just like you would expect. You can click through the steps, you can interact with the views, and just do anything you would do in desktop. Other than you can't change the story, but you can interact with it as a story.
Well, thanks for that excellent answer. So just to go back a little bit, how do you organize your findings so that you can create a story out of the data?
So one thing that I've found very useful is just to first of all create as many views as you can to just explore the data, and then start organizing them by just grouping them together. And I haven't talked about this much, but and this is also still very much kind of a thing that people just try out, and there isn't really a right answer for that. But I tend to group them together and then use, in Tableau, you can change the color of your tab. And so by changing the colors to say, well, there's a blue and there's a red and there's a green group, I can group those together and see what the steps are, what the kind of the big chunks are, and then try to figure out what the stepping is really through them and what I want and actually writing down sometimes just what are, if I were to just tell you the story, how would I say it in words? And so making a bullet list or writing down short sentences that say, well, here, I want to tell you this first, and then that, and then that. That can be very helpful to figure out what how you're going to actually sequence it, and then put it together in story points in particular, because you can very easily rearrange them. You can change the order. You can take things out. You can add things, and you can also then add more annotations. I didn't show this, but there's a feature that's called descriptions, where you can put a description on the story point that's not actually part of the view, and then you can also change things within the same view that's going to step through when you click through the story. And so you can start building that, and then you just have to go back and forth a lot and just really hone it and make it perfect. And that can be a lot of fine-tuning and polishing, where you change your colors and think about highlighting, think about removing things. That's a common thing, is that you remember, oh yeah, I had all these filters on it, I don't need anymore, because in the story I'm only looking at this part of the data anyway, so I can take those out and make them and just apply them to the whole thing. And do things like that. So it's both the visual refinement and the thinking about what to show and how to frame that to make it really perfect. And it really depends very much on what the story is. Some of them are very simple, very short. Some of them are longer, and so it can depend quite a bit on what you need to do.
Right. Lots of iteration, lots of testing, a lot of refinement.
Yes.
We talked about the audience's desire to have some book references, and we can obviously expand on these lists by email after your presentation, but can you reference any good blogs or sites on the web that might also be worth following?
Yeah, so there's actually a blog that is run by Cole Nussbaumer Knaflick, and I think it's called storytellingwithdata.com. So if you go to the rather obvious URL, storytelling with data, what Cole does is really interesting. She also just had a book out, by the way, which is also recommended. Even though it's not really specifically about the kind of thing that talked about today, but it's also called Storytelling with Data. So it's very clear in what it's trying to tell you. That it talks about lots of ways of making your data kind of speak for itself. So she talks about how to highlight, she talks about the use of color, the use of many different things that people tend to just overload their visualizations with. And it's much more hands-on. I don't want to say basic, because it does walk through quite a bit of theory and a lot of kind of good ideas, but it talks about tool use and like how do you do this in Excel, how do you do this in Tableau, and very, very kind of structural, very, very kind of simple things, but they're all very, very effective. And she's very good at just kind of taking things and reducing what's not needed. And her blog's really good. So this is storytellingwithdata.com. Other than that, storytelling with data blogs, most of the blogs are really more about data visualization more in general. And so there are a number of good ones. There's mine, of course, eagereyes.org. There's Flowing Data. There is a podcast, if you want to listen to people talk about data visualization, which is surprisingly interesting. It's called Data Stories. It's not focused on storytelling only, but it's actually about data visualization in general. So those are really good ones. So this is flowingdata.com, and the Data Stories, I think it's just datastories.com. And then my site is eagereyes.org, which of course I have to promote here as well. And then Tableau Public, I should also mention. Tableau Public has a blog and a visit of the day, which is a good place to go as well to look at good examples.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for those great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions that we didn't get to today, we'll be sending all the unanswered questions to Robert and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. I have just a few quick announcements. First of all, please mark your calendars for November 17th. That's our next Data Science Central webinar, How Data Science is Preventing College Dropouts and Advancing Student Success. And that'll be sponsored by Pivotal. Also, Today's taping will be available on demand for viewing later today, and you can find that on the home page of Data Science Central in the Webinar tab, located at the top of the page. So this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions, and a special thanks again to Tableau for their sponsorship and our speaker today, Robert Kosara, for his insight into today's topic. My name is Bill Vorhies. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on November 17th. Have a great day.